Hello and welcome to the Scars to Stars Summit. Thank you for joining. I would like to preface this talk with a content warning. I will be speaking about suicide and childhood sexual abuse. So please listen with care. And if you are experiencing any suicidal ideations or triggers, please seek out support. At the end of this discussion, I will share resources, including books and online websites where you can find that support. So, my name is Lorilee Binstock, and I am a trauma survivor thriver. Many of you might be asking, what is that? Because I know that I asked that same question when my therapist introduced herself as that. Um, I believe a trauma survivor thriver is someone who's experienced trauma, who's survived it, and is healing from it because it is a um, long-term journey, and someone who can turn that mess into their message, someone who has found purpose in so much um, adversity. And so I'm the host of the award-winning podcast, a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. And that's where I invite other trauma survivors to share their stories and how they overcame adversity. I am editor in chief of Authentic Insider Magazine, which is a platform for trauma survivors and experts in mental health, trauma, and healing who are available to write about their stories within these beautifully curated pages with the help of my creative director, Callie Binstock. And yes, we do have the same last name. It is a family affair. We're so passionate about using our talents to really focus on mental health and trauma to help ourselves heal. This is a healing process for ourselves as well. I am also the executive filmmaker of our own personal realities, a documentary I am currently producing that showcases the effectiveness of psychedelic assisted therapy for healing trauma. Um, and I will also share the proof of concept at the end of this discussion. I am a former television show producer and host. Um, and so what am I doing here? You might wonder. Well, I am sharing my story. So, in this discussion, I will share my personal experience with mental health and trauma and suicide and abuse. I will talk about my misdiagnosis of bipolar disorder, my long road with traditional therapy, and my incredibly healing road with holistic trauma therapy and alternative plant medicines, with detailed examples of each. But before we begin, this is going to be a heavy subject, and I know we'll probably have a lot of heavy subjects we'll be discussing today. But first, before we get started, I kind of wanted everyone to do some grounding work, some deep breaths, and whatever it is you need to do to kind of ground yourself. Um, this is 50 minutes, so I'm going to be diving deep. So again, thank you all for giving me this opportunity to share my story, because I do believe it is an important my story, your story, everyone's story is so important, and sharing each other's stories are extremely important. And so, deep breaths. So, for most of my life, I've experienced mental health issues. I was what people closest to me would call a troubled child, an extremely troubled. Some teachers would call me flaky. One actually told me that I should have been born a blonde, which is so offensive, not only to me, but also blondes. I know my hair is blonde now, but it's actually black, and it was black at that time. So these labels and perceptions, they led to more difficulties and challenges in my life. I had trouble in school. I had trouble focusing. I was diagnosed ADHD um, before I became a teenager. I began drinking and taking whatever drugs that were offered to me as early as 12 years old. I was extremely sexually active. I became suicidal. I self-harmed. And since the age of 13 until now, I'm 40 years old, I have had 6 suicide attempts in my life. From the outside, no one knew something darker was really brewing inside of me. No one knew about these suicide attempts except for my parents. And before I was an adult, I had 4 suicide attempts um, that my parents wanted handled behind closed doors. So, as a Filipino American with immigrant parents, the shame that brought needed to be kept in the dark. Um, my mom worked in the medical field, and so she didn't want anyone finding out that there was something wrong with this family. Um, and it was really difficult because she worked in the medical field also. She thought she could handle me coming out of these suicide attempts. And I don't feel like at that time, I may have felt like I wanted to die, but I don't think that was the reason why I had these suicide attempts. I feel like I was calling out for help because, again, this was in the 80s, this is in the 90s, and no one talked about mental health. It was just not discussed. It was such a taboo subject. Um, and for us being immigrants, we just pretended that didn't exist. And so I felt like it was a cry out for help. I asked multiple times, I asked my parents, can I see a professional? Can I see someone to talk about my feelings that I have? Um, and I was completely rebuffed every time. And so I felt these suicide attempts were my way of saying, hey, if I if something bad, really, really bad happens, they have to take me to the hospital and I have to be able to talk to somebody. Well, that never happened. Um, I will say some higher power wouldn't let me leave this earth. And now I know why. And I know that there was a reason for that. Um, but it still didn't fix anything at that time. I got older, my suicide attempts became more sophisticated, sending me to a county psych ward at a hospital um, and put on a 72-hour hold, which I believe in Florida they call the Baker Act, but it's basically um, you professionals have determined that you are a danger to yourself and others, therefore, they can detain you until they feel that it is safe to release you out into the world. Um, I was actually 25 at the time. I was working as a morning show producer, morning show anchor for a television station in Virginia. And so there, when I was brought into this place, I woke up um from an overdose and I was in a hospital gown and laces out of my shoes. I don't even know who put those shoes on me. Um but I woke up in this hospital room with another person in the next bed and I just remember thinking, where the hell am I and what happened? Um There they I was told that I saw somebody and was told that I needed to go to different support groups. Well, I saw the psychiatrist, the attending psychiatrist there. They decided to diagnose me with bipolar disorder, prescribe me on lithium and Topamax, which is an antipsychotic that I would start immediately, and they needed to see me take it. Um, and like I mentioned at the time, I was working as a morning show producer, and funny story for this network, it was an ABC local network, and at the hospital, on their TV, that was the only station they played, and I kept seeing whenever I would walk by to go to the bathroom, I would see promos of promotional videos and photos of me and my co-anchor, and I was just the shame I felt when people would look at me was just so intense that I decided I was not going to leave my room. And mind you, going to these group therapy sessions, art therapy sessions, that's the only way you're going to actually be able to leave the hospital. Otherwise, they're gonna keep you there for as long as they can. Um, and so I decided I was just gonna stay in my room. I was going to stay there. I would not show my face. But after a few days, you're like, I got to get out of here. And so I started attending these group therapy sessions, and I didn't say a word. I always looked down. I didn't benefit from it, but they did release me. Um, and luckily, I had not lost my job yet. And even though I, to them, I completely abandoned them. And in many ways, I did. But I obviously had my own issues that I couldn't manage and to keep my reality going. And so being on these medications, lithium and Topamax, which is an antipsychotic, they really took a hold of me. One of the side effects of Topamax is actually uh, memory loss. And so, as a morning show anchor on a 2-hour morning show where you're many times reading off a prompter, but a lot of the times just chatting. And I just remember forgetting what I would be saying mid sentence. It was humiliating. I wanted to curl up and die. But um, just when you thought like things have gotten bad, it just got worse. And so, I talked to my news director. I decided that I was going to finish out my contract, but I would be stepping down as anchor to a reporter and a noon producer and anchor, which was part of a 30-minute live show versus a 2-hour live morning show. And eventually I finished out the rest of my contract, and I decided to move to DC with my boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband. And for the next 10 years after that stint at that county psych ward, I juggled different medications to manage my bipolar. And while I struggled with suicidal ideations, it was at the age of 34 when I learned about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Um, I've heard of it before. I never really explored it, but when I heard PTSD back then, I thought veterans, soldiers, not me. Um, and so when I was working as a publicist for an author, Dr. Suvrat Bhargave, a phenomenal, phenomenal client, phenomenal author, he shared his personal story of sexual abuse and suicide. And I was very intrigued with this story. He was sexually abused by an uncle. What I haven't mentioned is that I was actually sexually abused by my biological father around the age of 9 years old. I was being abused, and I had heard very few stories of people experiencing sexual abuse, especially by a biological relative. So I did not talk about this at all. It was one of those things that I was like, "I'm gonna keep to my grave." Well, interesting enough, Dr. Bargave constantly said, "I'm gonna take this to my grave." And so it was just things started coming out, and I started feeling like I needed to do some research. Um And I took that story, my personal story of sexual abuse, and I buried it deep, deep, deep down in the darkest parts of my soul. So I didn't know that it was affecting my behavior. But the more I learned from this author, the more I started questioning my bipolar diagnosis, because they specifically said bipolar disorder looks exactly like PTSD in some ways. I was just like, what if? What if I could be experiencing PTSD and not suffering from bipolar disorder? I spent so much time researching this. And the more I did, the more aware I became of my behaviors and how much of it stemmed from the abuse. It was like textbook, my symptoms, my behaviors of someone who had experienced sexual abuse. All the things that I've mentioned before, the ADHD, I always kept trying to block that out to the point where I could never focus. So they assumed I was ADHD in school. Um, I was sexually active. Apparently, that can be um, a symptom of childhood sexual abuse. I was very reactive. I was very angry. Um, but I really still didn't know what to do. I so I decided I was going to see my therapist more. I actually said that I told the person I was working for that I could no longer be working or freelancing, especially for this doctor, even though he was amazing and I just loved his just talking to him. I felt triggered every time I heard more and more stories, and so I had to walk away, and they were very understanding. So it was time for me to explore what was happening to me. I decided that I was going to see my psychiatrist, who had been prescribing me my bipolar medications, and I obviously they couldn't just say, "Oh, you think you have PTSD? Great, let's take you off of the bipolar medication." No, they needed to know why. And every time I scheduled him weekly at this point, and every time I went in, I'd be like, "Okay, I'm ready to tell you what's going on with me." And I would just sit there with my mouth open and not say a word. Just wouldn't come out of my mouth. It was so difficult. And so I did this every day or every week because it was a weekly appointment until the holidays. When I started working for Dr. Bargave, it was the summer of 2019. So by the time it was the winter of 2019, um, we were traveling, my husband, my two children at this time. We're traveling to Florida, me to Jacksonville. We were going to Jacksonville first to spend time with my family and then go down to Florida or Miami, Florida, up to spend time with my husband's family. And I've always felt uneasy being in my childhood home, but it felt like torture. Being in my childhood home, I was very reactive. I yelled at everybody. My husband didn't understand what was happening with me. And, there were so many times where he said, "Are you okay? This is weird. What's happening? Do you want to leave to go to Miami sooner?" And I kept saying I was just going to push through it. Um, And I basically did. It was unbearable for him and just torturous for me. And we eventually left to go to Miami. Things were a little bit better, but our relationship was not cohesive. It was very everything was making me angry. And the energy that I was sending out was just made everyone so uncomfortable around me. But eventually we got back to Washington, D.C., which is where I live currently with my family. And I kept researching. I kept going back to my therapist. I don't know what's going on. I want to tell you what's happened, but I can't. Um, February 4th came around, and which was my final, that day I had my final and more recent suicide attempt, which um, there was, it fell apart. Um, But my husband found me, and he at this point, I wanted to die. I felt like I was stuck in some sort of hellhole, and I remember telling my husband, like, "I've been sexually abused." I think my husband kinda had an idea that that had happened, but then it took forever, but eventually I said, "By my dad." And while he was shocked, he was not nearly surprised as I thought he would be. Um he's always been very uncomfortable around my dad. And my husband is typically comfortable in in any situation. Um, and I think he just brushed it off. Oh, it's my girlfriend's dad, and that's why it's weird. But no, my dad made things weird. Um, So eventually we discussed what we were going to do, and we decided that I was going to go into a residential treatment center, and we decided that I was going to go to Sierra Tucson in Arizona, and that would probably be the most incredible decision that I have ever made for myself. I know that to my husband, that is such a big deal. Um, and it really did change my life. And so I want to kind of go into what Sierra Tucson was like and what I learned from that experience. Um, so this was February of 2020 when I finally, it's about a week and a half after my suicide attempt. And about a week and a half later, I was on a plane to Tucson. And there it was the safest I've ever felt. Healing from trauma can be so difficult when you have to go back to your regular responsibilities, especially if it includes children. Um, Even though I was seeing a therapist and going to therapy, and I wasn't going to trauma therapy, I was going to traditional therapy. And I don't want to say anything terrible about traditional therapy, but I had been going to traditional therapy at that point since I was 18 years old. Once I was able to see a therapist on my own and schedule a therapy appointment, I went to a therapist and I didn't know who to see. I just needed to talk to somebody. And for a lot of people that's great, but for trauma survivors, things need to be a little bit different, in my opinion. Um, and so when I got to Sierra Tucson, I started learning about trauma. We had a whole itinerary and agenda for the day where there it included lectures, individual um, support, um, psychiatry, therapy, group support, equine therapy, um, and body work therapy, massages and acupuncture and cranial sacral and somatic emotional release. There was so much that was available. But what really sucked me in was the somatic experiencing work. They really relied heavily on that because it really teaches you what trauma actually is. And, somatic experiencing works to help like the nervous system to bring it back online, and help restore safety to individuals, trauma survivors. And, this is what I learned is this can really only happen during what they call is biological completion. And the trauma energy is actually, it has to have the opportunity to reintegrate back into the body. So we typically, when we experience trauma, we feel that uncomfortable feeling, so we freeze, we push it away, and it gets stuck in our in your body. Somatic experience uses a clinical map to access the physiological states, because somatic is your body, and the um um, that is the whole idea, is how trauma affects the body. And so we have to access these physiological states of survival, which they call fight, flight, and freeze. Many of you may be familiar with that. And it has to help release, that self-protective, that defensive response that we hold into our body. So, when an event happens too fast and we do not have the time or the ability to um, for self-protection or defense, our energy gets stuck in our body. We typically freeze and then we kind of brush it off. Um, but that stuck energy is what causes those trauma symptoms. The PTSD is your body holding on to that stress, that trauma, that those emotions. So, um, in a way, like, humans are no different than animals in the wild, but when an animal, has been under threat, they will reset their nervous systems by shaking, um, which this is what they call the biological completion for the animal, and it allows the nervous system to kind of restore its sense of well-being. And, there's this window of tolerance, and if you go out of this window of tolerance, you kind of have to go back into it, and by crying, screaming, processing. um but too sophisticated for that. We like to just shut all of that off and lock it away and throw away the key. And what we need to learn, I've learned, is we need to feel what's happening, process it, and let it just move through our bodies. Um, so that was a huge thing. That was just an incredible experience to understand trauma. So I had that awareness in me. Um, I also did some EMDR therapy, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy, which you may have seen could be done with a light bar or clickers or tapping. Um, there's just so many ways, but the whole idea is to take that trauma that you've experienced and with that move it to a part of your brain from move it from the emotional part to the rational part. So you're able to look at your trauma in a different way. It doesn't affect you emotionally as it used to. Um, and that was life changing for me because that's how it all started. We learned about revisioning. Um, we learned about body work. We learned about somatic emotional release, cranial sacral, acupuncture. There was just so much information that I didn't even know existed out in the world. And we were introduced to all of this stuff. Um, and as I mentioned before, when I was in the county hospital psych ward, I didn't want to be a part of group therapy. You better believe I was still not okay with group therapy. Um, but, you know, the first time after I did EMDR, because I talked to my eventually told my therapist, um, she actually shared, I told my therapist and it felt good, but I still had this cringe feeling of like, oh, that happened. And so we did EMDR therapy. And that changed everything. After that, I was able to just say what happened and not feel shame. And that was incredible. And so when I went to group therapy sessions after the EMDR, I was able to just talk about what had happened, talk about the sexual abuse by my biological father, which took me forever to say. And the more I said it, the more I felt more comfortable with it. And the first time I said it, I was always the quiet person. I don't think people ever really noticed me. But after I said and shared my story, I cannot tell you how many people came up to me and shared that they think that's what happened to them or that it did happen to them or they had been in this facility for months and they still weren't able to talk about their own trauma, but this gave them permission. It gave them the courage to share their story, and that's when I realized the power of sharing your story. you know the way the group responded was just incredible, and I felt so safe. And I will tell you, and I think I said this, this was the safest I've ever felt. um, and I want to plug, Tar Network and Tar Anon because, you know, I didn't know the power of support groups. Support groups are so empowering. And I think we're fortunate to know have Tar Anon um Mondays at 6 p.m. Eastern. Um it's such a great resource to be able to check in with other people and hear other people's stories and say, "Oh my gosh, that happened to me too." Um, so I think it is a pretty incredible thing, and this is exactly why I'm here is because I want to share my story. But I also want to talk about all the things that made me heal because I didn't know about this stuff, and when I started sharing it just with my personal friends and family, um they were also blown away, and they want and unfortunately, it's still hard to find these types of therapies, um, but, you know, we forget how important and effective acupuncture could be, um, in cranial sacral and massages and body work, and I do wanna say, like, I never heard of somatic emotional release. I did speak about somatic experiencing, but somatic emotional release, that was where it's where they massage you. You're kind of sharing while they're massaging. At that time, I had this insane neck pain. It was just a big knot, and I could barely. I was turning like this to everyone, and my masseuse asked, "Oh, your neck is really, you know, it seems really rough in there. Have you been in a car accident?" And I remember being like, "No, actually, yes. When I was 16, though, so it probably doesn't matter. When I was 16, I got in a car accident, and yeah, I got whiplashed." And then she started asking me about that car accident, and I remember getting flashbacks and thinking, "Oh my god, that's." I just remember hydroplaning into a car. But these flashbacks that I was getting on her table were telling me otherwise. While it was wet, it wasn't raining, I don't believe, maybe it was sprinkling, but it wasn't enough to hydroplane. But then I started flashing back to right before I was in a bathroom and I had taken several pills. I was trying to commit suicide, and I got in my car, and I am so ashamed of that now, because I could have easily hurt anybody. But I started understanding, at that point I said, "Oh, I've had 5 suicide attempts," and sometimes I still get that wrong. But I forgot that that car accident that I had at the age of 16 was a suicide attempt, and I didn't remember because I was so drugged up, and it was a really just a traumatic accident for myself. No one was hurt, um, but I did hurt my neck, and I don't know if that would have come out, if I would ever understand what had, the actual story of what was happening that day, if it wasn't for that somatic emotional release. And so, like I mentioned, I was actually, before I went on her table, I was just turning like this. As soon as I got up from her table, my range of motion changed immediately. And I realized I had that trapped energy just still there. And I didn't even know it. And it's the power of these things, the body work, the trauma is so, just the awareness of it is just incredible. And so, the I did so much when I was there. I was like, I'm going to try everything and I'm going to learn everything I can. And I learned I was told to read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and that also changed my life because I felt like he wrote this book about me and childhood sexual abuse. And the awareness you get from understanding what is happening to you is a game changer. And, I was there, like I said, I was actually there February of 2020, right before they shut down the world because of the pandemic. I I had no idea. They take your phone, you can only talk by what is like a phone booth to your family members. My husband didn't feel the need to really tell me exactly what was happening. He did mention like our children were coming out of school for a couple weeks. I was like, "Oh, interesting." Um but I actually ended up staying at Sierra Tucson for 31 days without this knowledge. People were trickling in and they were um concerned because the world was shutting down and they were in a panic. And I thought, this is a mental health facility. Maybe they think something's wrong. But I never thought anything serious was happening. Um, and the day I actually got out was April 1st. So a lot had happened between um, late February and April 1st. And I remember our last day before the airport, they took us to CVS to get whatever we needed, our prescriptions, which I do want to say, they realized I wasn't bipolar and that I was struggling with PTSD. And so I was able to taper off of the medication that I was on for bipolar disorder, but they did put me on Zoloft. Zoloft was able to keep help me get the fire out. I was also still taking ADHD medications, but such a low dose. And what I learned about my ADHD diagnosis was that we experience trauma. We get distracted. We disassociate. It can appear as ADHD. Um, but it's really PTSD, believe it or not. And so I remember going to the CVS, getting my medication, and being weirded out by all of the toilet paper that people were asking for, and there was no toilet paper. And I remember thinking, "Oh, this is weird." And my husband told me if I can get a mask, and I was like, "Okay." And hand sanitizer, and I remember asking the person behind the counter for, "Where's your hand sanitizer?" And they literally laughed in my face as if I was stuck under a rock, which I kind of was. But I didn't realize it until I got to the airport. No one was at the airport. It was terrifying. There was, I think, two people on my flight, and the other person could have been a flight attendant. um, but it was so interesting being there. Um, for people who are in residential treatment, it is required or encouraged to seek a step down program, partial hospitalization. So you kind of gradually assimilate to old behavior, your real life, the reality of responsibilities. Um, and we couldn't get a hold of anybody. I didn't understand. They said, "Oh, COVID, there's a situation happening." And people aren't going into the offices. And so people weren't answering their phones, but we were able to get a hold of somebody in Florida. And so we decided that I was going to go down to my in-laws and we were going to stay there. My husband was going to drive down with our kids, and that's where I was going to go to a partial hospitalization program. And I did. And I believe they said they were trauma informed, but they weren't. So I have to say, I want to mention, Sierra Tucson is not trauma, or is trauma informed, but the other place I went to, I don't think they are actually trauma informed, and you can see the stark difference. All these new age things that we were learning about and teaching about at Sierra Tucson, they didn't have it at it was a lot of traditional therapy in this new facility, and it was fine. It was fine. I don't know if I would have been able to begin my healing process as drastically if I started at a place like the my partial hospitalization program, or their residential treatment center, because it was just really different in how they taught. And I really felt like there needed to be some awareness there. So what I didn't mention that I'm a writer. I like to write pilots. That's kind of my art, and so that's what I focused on when I was at Sierra Tucson. Is my art therapy was writing, and it was writing these screenplays. And so I wanted to write the screenplay based on my own experience at Sierra Tucson, kind of educational, and informative, but funny, and from my perspective. And in doing so, I wanted to do more research on somatic experiencing, more research in all of the things that I was learning. And in doing so, I started interviewing people about this stuff and recording it. And I thought, what could I do? I should put together a podcast, get this out there sooner. There's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done if I want to create the screenplay. But at this time, podcasts were like kind of blowing up. So I figured out how to do a podcast, and I did it. And, the first podcast that I released, I really summarized my story. Um, in a smaller version than what I'm talking about now. I realized how much, it was is helping others. My The day I released it, I was so nervous because a lot of the people I knew didn't know this was happening to me. And really, I was able to share my story with all these strangers, but it gets a little scarier sharing the story with people because they feel so invested. They know you. Why didn't we see these signs? But what happened was after I released it, I got phone calls, emails, text messages, direct messages through social media. I didn't even know you could call somebody through Facebook. And I got phone calls through Facebook for people who didn't know my phone number, but they saw me online, and they would tell me like, "Oh, I was sexually abused." And actually, a cousin of mine reached out and said, "I was sexually abused by my father, my uncle, and your dad, my father, tried to sexually abuse them." I couldn't tell you how hard that was to hear. And I just imagine in my head, God, if I just said something, what could have happened? There's so much value in sharing your story, whether it's to help yourself, whether it's to help others. Um, I didn't completely give up writing film writing, but I really invested my time in this podcast. I wanted to I wanted other people to share their stories. I started off speaking with experts, but I thought, oh, I need to do both. I need to do both. And so more and more people actually started wanting to come on my show. Um, but I only wanted to invest like in a weekly show. I had children at the time. They were not in school. They were being home. This was the summer, but I knew they were going to be homeschooled. So I knew I couldn't make such an intense commitment by having like a podcast for more than a week. Um, but there were these people who came to me sharing incredible stories. And I had decided that I was just going to go ahead and I had an intern at the time because I there was a lot of things I didn't know about social media, and she helped me, and she said, why don't you start a digital magazine? That is so big with Gen Zers." And I was like, "Oh, that is really smart. Let's talk about that. What would we put in it? Who can it help?" And then I realized all these people who wanted to come on the podcast, who I couldn't get on the podcast, I directed them to the magazine, and they shared their stories. Um, and it's still just such something that's kept going, and there's so many amazing monthly contributors, and I love the contributors who come in and just who are guest contributors. I highly recommend, you check it out, but the importance of sharing your story is it's really the best remedy. It helps jumpstart your healing process, and it really changes everything. Um And in saying that, I wanted to, mention that once after I got out of, um, my partial hospitalization program, I continued doing the podcast. I'm still doing the podcast to this day, so it's been about 4 years, and I found a therapist through this podcast. I found the value in knowledge of psychedelic assisted therapy through the people I've met on this podcast, and I do want to go into that. Well, I don't know how many folks here have heard or done their research on psychedelic assisted therapy, but I actually had looked into it prior to going into therapy because I don't know what I think I watched Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow's show, and they talked about it. And the truth is I actually experienced the psychedelics as a teen because, like I said, I was taking whatever drug I was given. But I really did some research and I met somebody I met a therapist who did integrative work. I met someone who was a sitter, and who helps administer the medication. And I started off with MDMA assisted therapy. So at this point in my healing journey, I did a lot of work, and I was, fires were put out, but there was still this feeling of worthlessness and some bit of anger towards my father, and a little bit towards my mother. And so this therapy that I did, I started off with MDMA. Um, and like I said, I was on Zoloft at this point. Or actually I had to wean off the Zoloft in order to do the MDMA assisted therapy. And in that therapy session, I know I did a lot of healing when it came with EMDR, when it came to the sexual abuse, but the MDMA actually gave me a different perspective. In this journey, I saw my father as a child, and I saw him walking in the Philippines around their house, and I saw the abuse. I saw his abuse and the abuse of his siblings. And I wasn't angry anymore. I found so much compassion for my father's, inner child. And while I still don't have a relationship with my dad, we cut that off. That anger that I had towards him subsided, and that anger that was in me subsided, and it didn't affect other areas of my life because I was extremely reactive. But I was able to really let that go, and that felt so good in my everyday life. After that journey, there's a lot of things that happened in that journey, but that was one of the big things. And I didn't have to go back on the Zoloft. I felt well enough that I didn't need to go back on it. The Adderall, on the other hand, I stayed on the Adderall. And then 6 months later, I did another journey, an MDMA assisted therapy there. And at that time, I was really angry towards my mom because my mom was so upset that she could not see our grandchildren because I told them, or her grandchildren, I told her I wasn't bringing my children around the house. And she was so devastated by that. And I was so mad. I was like, I'm done with you. I'm so done with you. But once once I did this assisted therapy, immediately I started this horrible, horrible feeling of losing my child, losing my daughter. It was devastating. I don't know what I looked like, but the sitter I was with was like, "What's going on? Are you okay?" And I was like, "I don't feel right. I don't feel good. I feel like I'm losing my daughter and it feels horrible." And she asked me that kind of what that brought me back to. And it made me realize that's how my mom felt. My mom, I told myself, I was like, I don't want this feeling. I want this feeling to go away. And I would do anything to get rid of that feeling. So when my sitter asked me what was that equating, or I was equating that to, and I thought about my mother, and I realized that's how my mother feels about losing me because she pretty much at that time had lost me. I was done with her. Um, And I was thinking like, "Oh, to feel that, I can't imagine." Oh, I mean, I actually imagined it. It was horrible. I could understand why my mom would say things like, "Can you forget that it happened so I can and we can move on?" To me, that was just her completely invalidating what had happened to me. But in reality, it was her trying to work through her own trauma in her head of losing me. For her, it was if I can get her to forget about it, I can see the grandkids. Um, and then I was able to just let that anger fall away. And so this is What a ride and what a journey it's been. I've since then I've tried psilocybin or magic mushroom assisted therapy. I've done LSD assisted therapy. Um, uh, and it was just such a powerful journey for me. I don't recognize who I was 4 years ago, and that was what pushed me to create this documentary, Our Own Personal Realities, and I, absolutely would like to share that with you right now. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share that. So I wanted to provide you with some resources. Again, my name is Lorilee Binstock. You can find me at traumasurvivorthriver.com. That's traumasurvivorthriver.com. You can also email me at Lorilee, Lorilee, at binstockmediagroup.com. That's Lorilee at binstockmediagroup.com. Some amazing resources, which you'll also find on my website, RAIN, that's RAINN.org, and that is the Rape, Assault, Incest National Network. And the statistics they have are up, resources all over the place. You can find those resources also at traumasurvivorthriver.com. Several of my books, if you're interested in learning about somatic experiencing, really any book by Peter Levine, but I did enjoy Waking the Tiger and In an Unspoken Voice. Um, that's also on my website. These resources are on my website. Again, traumasurvivorthriver.com. How the Body Keeps a Score was life changing for me. How to Change Your Mind. If you are interested in any psychedelic assisted therapy or just want to learn about it, because I think awareness is everything. You can check out How to Change Your Mind. It's actually a Netflix documentary series, How to Change Your Mind. Um, and it was actually based on the book by Michael Pollan, who he actually hosts the series as well by the same name, How to Change Your Mind. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to email me and reach out. Lori Lee at binstockmediagroup.com. I'm more than happy to answer any questions there. If you forget or think of something a week from now, please feel free to email me. I would love to hear from you. Um, More so than anything, I would love for you all to find the courage to share your story or talk more about your story. Um, like I said, there's so much power in it. And talk to other people. Just because someone says they're fine doesn't mean they're always fine. And I think just being there for people and practicing kindness is above all some of the best things you can do to create such a beautiful world that and really creating kindness and passing that along. I truly feel that is the key to happiness and peace in your life. Again, thank you so much. I'm Lorilee Binstock. I hope you enjoy the rest of these amazing speakers. Take care, everyone.